Hello, welcome back to our weekend reflection. We've been journeying through Matthew's Gospel, and this week the scene goes from people asking for a cure, scenes like the parables, a very different setting. It's the setting of where Matthew has Jesus say, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I shall build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." So it's the reading that we link with modern day papacy, but it's also about the place of Peter in the order of the apostles as named as leader by Jesus himself. So Michael Perotta will do the reading. Michael is an accountant. He commands his skills and very hard work at Melbourne Airport, and he also is our parish accountant. So Michael's going to take our reading from Matthew's Gospel, where Peter is declared to be the head of the apostles.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then Jesus sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. The Gospel of the Lord.
Who am I? What are they saying? Do they know the truth, or are they blind? Who am I? What do you call me? Tell me, what is my name? You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. I said you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. You are the Christ. You are my Lord. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. I said you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. You are the Christ, and you are my Lord.
Well, there's a very familiar reading, particularly to Roman Catholics, because we've taken this reading as a treasure that talks about what we call the Petrine office, the office of Peter and how it works in the church community. Now, have a look at these two shots, these two stills that we'll show you now. See, in the first one, it's very recognizable. It's the scene in Rome where the Via Conciliazione opens up into the piazza of St. Peter's. It was in time of Mussolini, not that long ago, that a whole range of buildings were knocked over so that from the Tiber River one could look up to St. Peter's and see it in its full glory. If you look at the famous, easily identifiable photo, you will see the Bernini columns that are almost like someone putting out their arms, that they enclose this rather large and wonderful piazza. And behind the where the columns reach into one another, you've got the Michelangelo's building of St. Peter's with the facade there at the front. Often these days Mass is celebrated in the open air. And behind that, of course, is the magnificent dome of St. Peter's. Now, all this stands for glory, triumph, power, a whole sense of the sovereign power, the kingship of the one that presides over earth and has this unique contact, if you like, with heaven. That's one view of Peter, and it's picked up very strongly and effectively in today's reading from Matthew. Have a look at this second shot, and it's the famous crucifixion of St. Peter, and it's depicted by the great artist Caravaggio. If you look at it, you'll see that Peter is an older man. He's lots of wear and tear has been part of his life from those early days when he was a fisherman on the Lake of Galilee. There's been a lot of energy, a lot of time spent trying to get a community of believers into some shape. And here Peter is depicted very much as vulnerable and about to be martyred. If you read John's Gospel, we get a very different feel for Peter than in Matthew. In Matthew, Peter is designated to be the leader. It's a formal moment, and he's called the Rock. And you then get the bit about that he will bind and loose those things that matter in the community. This is all because in Matthew he's trying to show how the community of believers has a legitimacy, that it's taken the chair of Moses, it's offered the new Moses, it has a sense of stability and, as I say, a legitimacy of its own. So Matthew presents Peter as a legitimate leader, and he is the presence upon the earth of the Lord of heaven and earth. When you look, but there's actually one thing to mention there, and that is that even though Matthew is very formal about having Jesus pronounce Peter as the great leader, he also throws in a little bit of a quirk that is interesting. After he calls Peter the rock, the foundation, the solid one, when Peter then remonstrates and says, no, look, you're not to go to Jerusalem and be hurt and broken, Jesus refers to Peter as a stumbling block. So the rock on one dimension stands for Peter as rock solid, but at the other time, when the heavy divine rock or boulder is mentioned, it's not the pretty helpful rock of solidarity and of reassurance, but Matthew has Jesus say, beware that this rock doesn't become a stumbling stone for yourself and for the community. So the point of Matthew's Gospel today is a proclamation about the legitimacy of moving from the synagogue to the house church, and the one who leads is Peter. When you go to John's Gospel, Peter is seen to be a liar and a fraud. Remember the story of the charcoal fire, and they're trying to get warm by it while Jesus is going through this trumped-up trial. And the woman says, "I think you're a Galilean, and aren't you one of Jesus' followers?" And 3 times Peter denies Jesus. And then the cock crew. Later, in the final chapter of St. John's Gospel, Jesus comes again to the charcoal fire on the beach and cooks breakfast for the depressed and anxious and broken disciples, because remember, they've fled to Galilee after the crucifixion of Jesus. The risen Lord is with them, and he says 3 times to Peter, "Simon Peter, do you love me?" And Peter knows what's going on, and so do the other apostles who were there. And 3 times Peter acknowledges the Lord. Now, what also happens after the reconciliation, after this terrible failure, betrayal, is that in John's Gospel we hear Jesus say, "There will be a time when you won't go where you want to. Someone else will come and tie a belt around you and take you to places you would not want to be." And there is the insight that Peter one day will be the martyr. So he's gone from being seen as the glorious but somewhat jumpy leader in Matthew to the wholehearted disciple who gives of himself, even of his life. That's in the Caravaggio shot. One of the things we have to realize is that Jesus didn't institute a papacy. Jesus named Peter as the leader of the apostles. And of course there is some debate in the Christian communities whether the Petrine office concluded with Peter, or whether it was meant to be kept until the end of time. Now, what's interesting, in the very early days of the Christian community, Peter was eventually regarded as the Bishop of Rome, the overseer of the Christian community in Rome. It was somewhat later that the Christian community used the word the Father, or the Pope, the Papa. What's the problem here is that gradually the Bishop of Rome was called a Pope, but not originally. Now what happens here is, unfortunately, the Christian community embraced the Roman Empire when Constantine invites them in and makes things public and open, but they all of a sudden assume, because the emperor himself was on side with them, that they become a new institution of power and glory, and they start to wield enormous power, what we call Christendom. And it's only now we're recognizing that we have to let go of the notion of Christendom. We are not a militant force that should exercise power. Leaders shouldn't be princes and so on. And we have that whole emergence of papacy as a secular rule, and it leads to an expectation that we have the power, we have the clout if we follow the way of the Lord. And there's been a whole revolution of thought that now recognises that the Pope, or the one that carries the office of Peter, will be a servant. And this Pope in particular, Pope Francis, has made that very clear, that we have had a long history, sadly, of powerful popes, at times righteous, but an expectation that they were in charge of the whole world. Now we take an attitude of let's return to the scripture. The legitimacy of Peter's office in Matthew, and particularly the recognition of Peter as the fragile one who is forgiven when he betrays Jesus, and then becomes the martyr for the cause. And he is one who gives of his life, of himself. He shares his faith unto the Lord as faithful servant. What's important to really notice here is that there's been an emerging sense of the office of Peter isn't out by itself. It's what the Pope calls these days to be associated with synod, meaning a gathering of people that share and mutually offer different gifts, different resources to leadership in church and in the wider faith community. This Pope has moved to a very direct attitude of renewal and reform of what was a Renaissance court and grew into a very powerful clique called Vatican State that ran not only the church, but in a sense for a long time ran the world. So what this gospel focuses on today in Matthew is the legitimacy of the leader. But the leader particularly that we see in John's gospel is the leader who gives of his life for the cause, and he is the symbol to bring diversity into unity, never uniformity, which becomes offensive and speaks of power, but to facilitate openness, healing, hope, and leading us back to the gospel. So where this comes together for us is that we are also the disciples in our time, and we also go through seasons of belief when we say there must be a God. Jesus is the Son of God. There'll be other times when, like the chilly early morning in the darkness of the high priest's court, that Peter denies having anything to do with Jesus. He's out of my life. And then the weeping big man on the shores of Galilee saying, Lord, I've messed it up. I am sorry. Feed my lambs, feed my sheep, is the reply of Jesus. And then the prediction in John that one day, Peter, you will really seal this commitment to my way. You'll be martyred for the cause. And in our lives too, there's the nailing that happens when we make an option to be followers of the Lord rather than to be very self-absorbed in getting our own way, of not giving, of not forgiving, of accumulating wealth, pleasure, whatever, rather than being of service to those in need. So I hope that this reflection that comes out of Matthew's Gospel this weekend may be helpful in the seasons of life that we journey through. finally, for those who are part of St Carthage's parish, during the year we have support of our St Vincent de Paul conference, but the winter appeal, and we're not quite sure about the Christmas appeal, whether they will go ahead. Certainly the first one couldn't because the churches were not open. So if you look in the web page of St Carthage's parish, we have a letter from the parish council and from David, President of St Vincent de Paul Conference, Parkville, inviting those who wish to contribute to the remarkable work of our St Vincent de Paul community, that you'll find the instructions there if you'd like to contribute something to the work of the Society of St Vincent de Paul that will help our own group continue to administer to those who are in distress, in anxiety, and without very little resources. Thank you for sharing, and we look forward to seeing you again next weekend.
You are